So on this very hot Sydney day, it's probably reached 37 by now. I'm making another video, and it's quite likely that it's going to be very long. Here's what I'll talk about. I'll talk about growing up. I'll talk about family life. And content warning, I will talk about domestic and family violence, poverty, lawlessness, abuse, those sorts of things. The identity of perpetrators. Surviving. I'll be talking about class. I'll be talking about depression and trauma. And I'll also be talking about hope and the desire to transcend all of the aforementioned. So, I'm 54 this year. I was born in Perth, Western Australia, in the outer suburbs, pretty much on the edge of the urban and rural divide. So I grew up south of the river in a place that is colloquially as a sort of municipal area called Armourhole. It's actually called Armidale, but it's colloquially known as Armourhole because no one who is wealthy or wants to live a life free of violence and conflict would live there. But it's naturally a cheaper area, or it was back then, to live in, to rent houses in, and so on. I went to a primary school called Kelmscott Primary School, Kelmscott Park Primary School, KPES. I'll have to check that. And then at a certain point, ended up moving with my mother and siblings to an area that's now known as Camillo, but then was known as Westfield. And so I went to Westfield Park Primary School. That's where I'm getting the park from, Kelmscott Primary School and then Westfield Park Primary School. In the last 2 years of my primary schooling, and then from there ended up at Kelmscott Senior High School, which was then the biggest public school in the state, and with lots of issues, staff-teacher ratio, teacher-student ratio being one of them. Sorry, my hair's really crap because of the weather. So I'm going to try to take in some of these years. Depending on how you count, okay, in terms of siblings that are directly related to me through both parents, I'm number 6. No, I'm number 5. I'd like to think I was the youngest, but I'm not. So I have 4 sisters. One of them is through my dad. My mum was her mother, but not her biological mother. There's so much of this story to tell. I also have half siblings. One who came back into our lives quite significantly and is still with us. But let's begin at the beginning. A lot had happened even before I was born. And my parents, although they weren't legally married, assumed the veneer of marital life. And why do I say that? Because my mum changed her surname so that she could live up to the appearance of being married without actually being married. Because for so many years my father was actually married to another woman, and that was the mother of my older sister, the biological mother. It wasn't until the annulment of that marriage came through that my mum was able to legally marry my father. But she had assumed the surname earlier in order to be able to give the appearance of being married, because especially when she married in the early 60s, it wasn't well seen to be shacked up with a man. and certainly not having the number of children that she ended up having, 6 of us. So in the first 10 years of my life, I think I lived in about 9 different places, if I'm not wrong. There were so many places. We're always on the move. And I've actually got an early poem about this that I wrote in the 90s called Laws of Perpetual Motion. And it's about always being on the move, always living in circumstances of threat, risk, indebtedness. My father himself went bankrupt 3 times in that period of my life, and so effectively was on the run, escaping his debts, escaping his past, escaping his responsibilities. This is a pattern in my father's life. Even before all of this, even before he'd met my mum, he left, absconded from Victoria, tried to make a plot with his mother to kidnap his 3 children with my older sister's biological mother, that is, to take them off her because he couldn't get custody of them and she had custody, and he and his mother disagreed with this, and so he took the law into his own hands, at her urging, I believe, and absconded from Victoria, took one of the children and left the other 2 behind, who were 2 boys. So what a start to life on the other side of the country. Running away from the law, beginning that pattern, changing your name, pretending to be who you weren't, wanting to run away from your past, not face up to things. This is very much the pattern of my father's life. Still being married to the woman as well. But I'm not going to delve into his life too much, albeit it is consequential. I'm going to talk about my early years and what it was like to move that often, to be under threat, to live through as well domestic violence. So my childhood is littered with examples of having to get away from my violent father, particularly as mum was beaten, having to seek refuge either in the neighbour's house, for example, or legal services, having to call the police when things happened, having to lie and pretend that nothing was happening when the police came to the door, being able to deliver my father over to the police one night, only to have nothing addressed, and him return to the family home. And the final cracker, when he actually beat my mum so hard that he knocked her unconscious and nearly gave her a brain hemorrhage. And that's what really brought in the legal support and the determination from my mum to finally leave him, because she had tried so many times. So I grew up living in fear, total fear, panic, instability, risk. And even after they had separated and the divorce finally came through and my mum had to do pretty much everything on her own and raise us as the head of the household, the threats were still there, the abuse, because I was abused by this individual, and the manipulation as well. One of those things that was used as an object of manipulation was my asthma, and my father tried to commandeer and use that as an excuse to leverage against my mother and would take her to family court and accuse her of being a bad mother. He didn't prevail, but he did have access visits. So picture this, by this stage we're living in Westfield and I went to Westfield Park Primary. It was a huge adjustment. But it was such good news when I heard my parents got divorced, when the word came through at school. Everyone else felt sorry for us, and I said, no, this is the best day of our lives. And it truly was. I felt my mother had been vindicated, but there was a lot more. I was so disappointed to hear that he had not custody, but access visits, and that I would have to go with my father pretty much every weekend or every second weekend. So why was I disappointed? Because I loathed him, and having already been, including in the house where my older brother died. This older brother of mine died of a heart defect. My older brother was witness to the beating and the conflicts between mum and dad, and would try to intervene. And he also really detested my father. My father acted like a tyrant and was an absolute alcoholic. So even with the access visits he would drink, that would have been grounds for him having his access rights removed. But so too would be the knowledge that he was interfering with, in this case, me. He was getting more than just access in legal terms. He had full access to me and to my person. And he also used the weapon of me being a sissy to sideline me and make me feel bad about myself, that I wasn't acceptable, such that I could never talk about these things, because inevitably it would be me that was at fault. I'm the one that was going to end up queer. I'm the one that needed to be controlled. I'm the one that he needed to take possession of. All of those things. He was a suffocating, asphyxiating individual. And besides actually, lying on top of me and having his way with me as a young person before the divorce, but also particularly during those access visits. My brother was asleep usually at this time. This was the most perverse thing, because I was being levelled with being a sissy, destined to grow up as a homosexual, end up on Queer Street like the rest of the family, because basically it was my mum's fault, right? That I was going to be turned into this queer, and that we were going to end up on Queer Street, which is an interesting phrase because it doesn't mean just being queer, it means like where everything in your life takes a downturn. It only stopped when I was of an age where I got a girlfriend, and I said to him publicly, I'm not coming with you anymore, I have a girlfriend. And that announced a separation of another kind. That is, you don't have access to me anymore. You don't, and it's a socially acceptable thing. It makes sense. I don't have to be commandeered and forced to go with him. Instead, I will go with my girlfriend. Now, of course, I was interested in this young woman. I myself was a young person, and we wrote romantic love letters every day at school, and we would get together after school, sometimes studying together, sometimes doing kind of exploratory things. But even then I felt like being a man wasn't me, and this is something that was a bone of contention between my parents, my abuser and my mother, but also used to gaslight me. I eventually disclosed what he had been doing, and I had a lot of what you might call body hauntings and out-of-body experiences, and the feeling of something being pressing on top of me, even though there was no one there, for years. And unfortunately, this was never seen as an issue. I was never taken to a specialist, but it is directly related to the abuse experiences, as I now know as an adult as well. So by the time most of my siblings have moved, and we've moved again because we had to constantly move, my mum and my little brother, my sisters got married and left the rental properties that we were in, I began to realise the full extent of things, and obviously to understand that I was not what either parent desired. Maybe I was queer, but also I needed to report to my mother. what had been going on. So the same day that I was going to a place to come out, because I'd moved out by then, okay, there's a lot that I've missed there, but effectively I determined that I had to move out because, unfortunately, the same violence that my father had subject my mother to was being repeated by another sibling. And I tried to intervene. I was trying to study because the previous year I dropped out of school because of all my mental health issues, also related to my sense of self and my body and so on, going through puberty. I spent a whole year looking for employment and having dropped out of school. When I finally determined to go back to a school, it was a different one, to do year 12. It was 3 bus rides away, but there was the same behaviour of this sibling being like my father and hitting my mother. Also affected by their consumption of substances. Rage. I was incapable of resolving that situation, and I was deeply triggered by it, to the extent that one night when I'd been staying at her sister's house when I was away, because she went away on some kind of workshop series, I had a huge asthma attack because I was so stressed, and it was the first time I could actually feel the full extent of what I had been re-immersed in. And so much silence, so much naturalization of these things, never talking about these things was going on. So a lot of things came to their head for me. I had moved out by then. By the time I was ready to tell that I was that queer that they didn't want, and also that I'd been interfered with, I had been living in Fremantle. This was my beginning of leaving, because to me it was so unacceptable that these forms of violence were being repeated, were being naturalized, tolerated, not talked about, and I needed to say that there's something really rotten at the heart of the family. And so I did. But it was exhausting because at the same time I was coming out to my mum, right? And so it's which way do we go, in terms of what to focus on? And my mum just was floored, I guess. But there was no way back because she didn't accept me for being queer, and she rejected me. And also my father then was after me because he heard about it secondhand, including the allegations, and that meant that when I ended up in Melbourne, because I basically ran away when I was 19,